Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 8, The Roumanian Disaster. We have seen how easily, at the beginning of 1916, Romania, in her isolated position, could have been induced or compelled to join the Teutonic powers. We have seen how Falkenhayn, by turning to the west towards France and allowing Austria to do the same towards Italy, had relieved Romania from adverse pressure, and enabled her to preserve for another 6 months her attitude of ambiguous watchfulness. Events of a decided character were now to take place. At the end of August, the second of the two great catastrophes which Falkenhayn's unwisdom had prepared fell upon the Central Empires. Romania declared war. Although this danger had been approaching since Brusilov's victory at the beginning of June and important precautionary measures taken to guard against it, the actual declaration came much sooner than the German government had expected, and fell as a shock upon German public opinion. A spontaneous movement of anger and disgust swept across the German Empire. The position of Germany was indeed more critical at this juncture than at any other period of the war until the final collapse. The Battle of Verdun was still making enormous inroads upon German resources, and a most serious moral defeat impended there. The Battle of the Somme was in full blast. The British, undeterred by their losses, continued to throw fresh divisions into the struggle, and to launch their formidable attacks at brief intervals. The strain upon the Germans in the West was intense. The sense of failure at Verdun, and of being slowly overpowered and worn down by superior forces on the Somme, had affected the morale of their troops. Physical exhaustion and battle losses had reduced the German reserves to the slenderest proportions, and many more weeks of crisis and uncertainty lay between the hard-pressed front and the shield of winter. Meanwhile, the failure of Austria was glaring. The whole southern front in the east was still in a state of flux. The Russian tide rolled forward. No limits could yet be assigned to its advance. Scores of thousands of Czech troops had eagerly surrendered to the enemy, and were being enrolled bodily as a separate army corps in the Russian ranks. The Italian counteroffensive on the Isonzo was developing. The whole resisting power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire quivered on the verge of collapse. At this moment a fresh, brave and well-trained army of 500,000 Romanians was thrown into the adverse scale, and entered the conflict in that very theatre where the Teutonic powers were weakest and most vulnerable. The vital granaries and oil fields of Romania were lost, and even the great Hungarian plain itself was in dire peril. All the time the pressure of the blockade sapped the vitality of the German masses, and hampered and complicated at 1,000 points the manufacture of war material. In this dark and almost desperate hour the Emperor, interpreting the mood of the German people, turned to the great twin captains of war who had defended the eastern marshes so long against heavy odds, and on whose brows still shone the lustre of Tannenberg. On August 28, the morrow of the Roumanian declaration, Falkenhayn was notified by Count von Nünker, head of the Emperor's military cabinet, and His Majesty had decided to summon Hindenburg and Ludendorff to his presence. Rightly accepting this intimation as dismissal, Falkenhayn resigned forthwith, and that same evening Hindenburg as chief of the staff and Ludendorff as first quartermaster general with equal powers assumed the supreme direction of the Central Empires in the war. Footnote: in the German army the deputies of the chief of the general staff bore the old title of quartermaster general. End of footnote. What are the relations between these two men? Hindenburg has described them as those of a happy marriage. In such a relationship, he writes, footnote, in Out of My Life, Marschall von Hindenburg, page 84, end of footnote. How can a third party clearly distinguish the merits of the individuals? They are one in thought and action, and often what the one says is only the expression of the wishes and feelings of the other. After I had learned the worth of General Ludendorff, and that was soon, I realized that one of my principal tasks was, as far as possible, to give free scope to the intellectual powers, the almost superhuman capacity for work, and untiring resolution of my Chief of Staff, and, if necessary, clear the way for him, the way in which our common desires and our common goal pointed. The harmony of our military-political convictions formed the basis for our joint views as to the proper use of our resources. Differences of opinion were easily reconciled, without our relations being disturbed by a feeling of forced submission on either side. The old field marshal was uplifted by his patriotism and character above jealousy. His great age and the vast changes which had taken place in warfare since he had passed his military prime led him willingly to leave the initiative, the preparation, and the execution almost entirely to his volcanic colleague, while he himself, in full agreement on the largest decisions, came in with ponderous weight to clear obstacles and opposition from the path. Throughout the struggle, an absolute unity was presented. But when we look beneath appearances to the facts, there can be no doubt that Ludendorff managed everything and that Hindenburg was chosen largely to enable him to manage everything. It was in Ludendorff's brain that the great decisions were taken. It was under his competent hand that the whole movement and control of the German armies, and of much more than the armies, proceeded. Ludendorff was the man of the German General Staff. His military priesthood was throughout the dominating and driving power of Germany, not only through the 52 months of the war, but to a very large extent in the situation that preceded it and brought it about. The representatives of the General Staff were bound together by the closest ties of professional comradeship and common doctrine. They were to the rest of the army what the Jesuits, in their greatest period, had been to the Church of Rome. Their representatives at the side of every commander and at headquarters spoke a language and preserved confidence of their own. The German generals of corps and armies, army group commanders, nay, Hindenburg himself, were treated by this confraternity to an extent almost incredible as figureheads, and frequently as nothing more. The General Staff, writes General von Moser, footnote, in Ernsthafte Plaudereien über den Weltkrieg by General von Moser, end of footnote, established an underground control of operations behind the backs of the commanding generals. It led one prominent general to declare, "I am fighting the enemy and the General Staff." On December 3, 1917, in the Cambrai battle, Moser himself relates that, as corps commander, he suggested to the Second Army the recapture of Boulogne-Wood the next day. To his surprise, his project was disapproved and the date fixed for the 9th. He subsequently ascertained that one of his own General Staff officers had spoken on the telephone to the Second Army and argued against the attack on the 4th and in favor of postponing it to the 9th. Everyone will remember the extraordinary incident of the visit of Colonel Hensch to the various army headquarters during the Battle of the Marne in 1914 as General Staff Representative of the Supreme Command. How, on the morning of September 9, he settled all vital matters with Bülow's chiefs of the staff while the old man was still in bed. and how at noon, at Kluck's headquarters, he gave his orders to the staff officer Kuhl, and neither mentioned Kluck nor asked to see him. Similarly, Generals von Lossberg, CGS of the Sixth Army, and von Kuhl, CGS of Ruprecht's group of armies, speak always, as the records show, in their own names and not those of Sixth von Armin or Ruprecht, whom they neither quote nor appear to consult. A British staff officer, whatever the facts, would at least have said, "The Chief of Army Commander wishes." But behind the scene of the German General Staff, all these formalities are dropped. The staffs arrange everything without a word about the authority, opinions, or desires of their generals. It is the General Staff which conducts the operations, gives decisions, and notifies them to the subordinate formations. Ludendorff throughout appears as the uncontested master. In his numerous conversations with the Chief of the Staff of the Fourth Army, the name of Hindenburg is never mentioned to justify or to support a decision. Footnote: the above facts are taken from the French translation of the captured documents of the German Fourth Army from the 9th to 30th of April 1918, and from a French review of them. End of footnote. This in no way detracts from the fame of Hindenburg, who yielded himself with magnanimity to a process which he was sure was in the best interests of his king and country. But it is necessary to state what is believed to be the truth. The golden opportunity for which Romania had so long watched had not only come, it had gone. As soon as the extent of the Russian victory was plainly apparent, the cabinet of Brătianu definitely decided to enter the war. The long period of perplexity, hesitation, and bargaining had reached its conclusion. Now or never was the moment for Romania to strike with all her strength for her national ambition and for the unity and integrity of the Romanian peoples. Once this decision was taken, not a day should have been lost in acting upon it. While Brusilov's armies were rolling forward in Galicia, while the Bohemian troops of Austria were eagerly surrendering by scores of thousands, while the enormous booty in prisoners, arms, and material was being collected by the astonished Russian soldiery, and before the German troops could be drawn from the north and the west to re-establish the shattered front, then was the hour for Romanian intervention. A general mobilization of the Romanian army, if ordered about June 10, would have enabled considerable Romanian forces to have come into action before the end of that month, and while the whole southeastern front of the Central Powers was in complete disorder. The consequences of this must have been far-reaching and might perhaps have proved decisive. The habit of bargaining, of waiting upon events, of trying to make hazard sure and wild adventure prudent, had become so deeply ingrained in Brătianu's policy that nearly 2 months were wasted in negotiations. Before they would commit themselves, the Romanian government must have everything settled, must be promised the highest reward, and guaranteed a practically complete immunity. Military conversations regulating the contingent movements of Russian troops and of the Salonika armies, and the supply of arms and munitions, not less than the political, financial, and territorial issues, were laboriously and meticulously debated by telegraph with the various Allied cabinets. The British and French governments, high in their hopes of impending victory on the Somme, were suddenly eager to secure Romanian aid at almost any price. Russia, for reasons which will presently be understood, appeared less ardent. Yet it was with Russia that all the principal military arrangements had perforce to be settled. In these discussions the rest of June and the whole of July slipped rapidly away. Meanwhile, Falkenhayn was not idle. Everywhere in the east the German troops stood immovable against the Russians, and from all parts of the German lines reinforcements were scraped together and hurried to the scene of Brusilov's incursion. By the end of June the Russian advance had slackened, and by the middle of July the Austro-German front was again continuous and more or less stabilized. The gravest apprehensions upon the attitude of Romania were justly entertained in Vienna, Berlin, and Sofia. And during June and July, Austrian and Bulgarian forces were steadily and to the fullest extent possible brought into precautionary positions near the Romanian frontiers. It was not until August 27 that Romania declared war on Austria-Hungary, ordered general mobilization and prepared to launch her armies into Transylvania. She had exacted the following military stipulations from the Allies. First, energetic action by the Russians against the Austrians, particularly in the Bukovina. Secondly, 2 Russian divisions and a cavalry division to be sent on the first day of mobilization into the Dobruja. And thirdly, an offensive by the Allies from Salonika simultaneously with the Romanian entry into the war. Not all these measures and their political counterparts put together were worth the month or 6 weeks of precious time that had been lost in their discussion. Prudence had become imprudence, and safety had been jeopardized by care and forethought. The Teutonic powers had escaped from the ruin with which the Brusilov disaster had menaced them before they were called upon to bear the assault of a new antagonist. And this assault was no longer unexpected, but foreseen and, so far as their resources allowed, prepared against. Nevertheless, the apparition in the field of Romania, with 23 organized divisions and with over 1,500,000 men capable of bearing arms, and the denial of the Romanian supplies of corn and oil, seemed both to friend and foe to constitute at this moment one of the most terrible blows which Germany and her reeling partner had yet been called upon to encounter. While the German and Bulgarian storm clouds are gathering around Romania, we must examine the situation on the Salonika front, from which Romania had been led to expect timely and immediate succor. The presence of the Allied army based on Salonika was one of the determining factors in the decision of Romania. Nearly 400,000 men of 5 nations, French, British, and Serbian, an Italian division and a Russian brigade, were now scattered along and behind the front established at the foot of the Bulgarian mountain wall. Romania had stipulated that this army should begin a general offensive against the Bulgarians, if possible a fortnight before and at the worst simultaneously with her entry into the war. Both the British and French governments had agreed to this. Accordingly, on Joffre had fallen the duty of ordering General Sarai, who commanded the Allied army, to set his forces in motion not later than August 10. At the moment which is judged opportune, the Army of the Orient will attack, with all forces united, the Allied enemy along the Greek frontier, and, in case of success, will pursue them in the general direction of Sofia. This ambitious command did not correspond with the realities. The British commander-in-chief, General Milne, reported that an offensive against the Bulgarians would not succeed. He thought that determined troops could hold the Bulgarian position forever. The extent of the front, the lack of adequate forces, the difficulties of cooperation between 3 nationalities, the doubtful quality of the Serbians on the exposed left flank, and the inadequate heavy artillery were among the adverse points on which he dwelt. Sir William Robertson recorded his opinion that the Bulgarians were fine fighters in their own country, that the Serbians had not recovered from their disaster, and that not a single British officer was in favor of the enterprise. The British government had no confidence in General Serai, and friction was continuous between him and his British colleagues. These pessimistic views were not entirely justified by the subsequent facts. The Serbians, after reorganization, training and feeding, showed themselves, when the time came, implacable troops. But it is remarkable that the British cabinet, in the face of the reports submitted to them, should nevertheless have joined with the French in encouraging Romania to count upon an effective offensive by the Salonika army. There was indeed no means by which the Allied forces in the Balkans could prevent Bulgaria from throwing her main strength against Romania. In the upshot, it was arranged that General Milne, with the British, should guard Sarail's right flank in an active defensive, while Sarail himself was forced to reduce the general offensive ordered by Joffre to demonstrations and an enveloping attack by the Serbians. Even so, he had to feed 8 divisions along a single line of railway. On the whole front, he could muster no more than 14 divisions against 23 Bulgarian and German divisions fortified on strong mountain lines. The date, even, of these limited operations was retarded until the end of September. Meanwhile, the German Bulgarians struck first, and though repulsed elsewhere, reached the sea and captured a Greek division at Kavala on September 18. In the circumstances, it was remarkable that Serai should have succeeded to the extent of taking Monastir. On the actual front of attack, the forces were almost equal. Each mustered 190,000 men and 800 or 900 guns. But the achievement in no way influenced the struggle in which the fate of Romania was decided. Had all the faults of temperament and character which are charged against General Serai been replaced by equally undisputed virtues, no better result could have been obtained. The perilous position of Romania became apparent from the moment of her declaration of war. The main portion of the kingdom consisted of a tongue of land about 300 miles long and 100 wide, between the wall of the Transylvanian Alps on the north and the broad Danube on the south. About the center of this tongue lay the capital, Bucharest. Beyond the mountains gathered the Austrians and the Germans. Behind the Danube the Bulgarians crouched. 4 months sufficed to crack Romania like a nut between these pincers. A word may be said about each of the Romanian frontiers. The Danube, which here flows for a great part of its course through a deep trough in the plain and is in many places nearly a mile wide, appeared a trusty barrier. The principal passages at Sistova, Turturcai, and Silistria were guarded by fortresses reckoned formidable before the advent of the heavy howitzer. As the Danube descends to its mouth, it encloses between its waters and the Black Sea the province of the Dobruja, which Romania had at the end of the Second Balkan War seized without fighting from prostrate Bulgaria. An advance into the Dobruja, left hand on the Danube, right hand on the seashore, stirred every Bulgarian ambition and cut at the very root of the Romanian tongue. The mountain range to the north was more effective defense than the line of the Danube. The Transylvanian Alps rise to a height of 6,000 or 7,000 feet by 3 tiers of forests, of grassy upland, and finally of rocky but rounded summits. This rampart is pierced from north to south by 4 major passes. Sudden clefts 2,000 or 3,000 feet deep and many miles in length, traversed by inferior roads, of which the most westerly is the one which follows the Vulcan Pass. The Transylvanian Alps turn at their eastern extremity through more than a right angle into the Carpathians, between which and the Russian frontier on the river Prut lies Moldavia, the northern province of Romania. Such was the theatre of the new war. Romania mobilized on August 27 23 divisions, of which 10 were well-trained, 5 less well-trained, and the remainder reserve formations, aggregating over 500,000 men. The Romanian army was however weak in artillery and ill-supplied with ammunition. Her principal arsenal had exploded mysteriously a few days before her entry into the war. She was ill-equipped with field telephones and possessed very few aeroplanes, no trench mortars and no poison gas. Her statesmen seem, at first, to have cherished the hope, fantastic in view of the past, that Bulgaria would not declare war upon her. When this hope was dispelled on September 1, Romania continued to trust to the intervention of General Sarai to hold the Bulgarian strength on the Salonika front. She also hoped that the Germans would be too hard-pressed to spare any substantial forces, and she relied upon definite promises of strong and prompt Russian aid. The Romanian forces were divided into 4 armies, of which the third guarded the Danube and the Dobruja. The first and second held the passes through the Transylvanian Alps, and the fourth, hoping later for cooperation from the second, invaded Transylvania through the Carpathians. A central reserve of 50,000 men guarded Bucharest. At the outset there were in Transylvania only 5 tired Austrian divisions, but in the early part of September 4 German divisions were already approaching. Of these troops, Falkenhayn was himself placed in command on September 6. Beyond the Danube and towards the Dobruja, 3 Bulgarian divisions and a cavalry division and part of a German division from the Salonika front were assembled under the redoubtable Mackensen. Although the Romanians had a large numerical superiority, it was impossible to study the war map without anxiety. Mr. Lloyd George, then Secretary of State for War, explained to me fully the situation. And after we had mutually alarmed each other in a long talk at Walton Heath, he wrote a serious, though belated warning to the Prime Minister. Sarai and the Salonika army could not be got into motion. There remained only the Russian aid, and here again fortune was perverse. The treaty which the old king of Romania had made before the war with Austria-Hungary had led Russia to regard Romania as a potential enemy. In consequence, the South Russian railway system withered away towards the Romanian frontier, and there was actually a gap of 20 miles between the Russian railhead at Reni and the nearest Romanian line at Galați. It was therefore impossible for Russia to come with any speed to the succor of her new ally. Alexeyev and the very able Russian staff understood the Romanian problem far better than the impatient Western allies, and their misgivings had been apparent in the lukewarm attitude of Russia towards Romanian intervention. Jubilation at the accession of a new ally was still resounding through the French and British press when startling news arrived. On September 1, Mackensen invaded the Dobruja. On September 6, with the Bulgarian army and German howitzers, he smashed the Danubian fortress of Turturcai and captured 25,000 Romanians and 100 guns. Swiftly advancing through the Dobruja, Mackensen had by the end of September come almost abreast of Constanța on the Black Sea, taking the abandoned fortress of Silistria on his way. By the 3rd week in October he had taken Constanța. Leaving half his army to defend the conquered territory by an entrenched line from the Danube to the sea, he brought the remainder, strengthened by a Turkish division and an additional Bulgarian division, across the Danube opposite Bucharest, which he threatened at a distance of barely 40 miles. This menace was not without its object. While the Bulgarian invasion of the Dobruja had been proceeding, Falkenhayn was probing the passes of the Transylvanian Alps and seeking incessantly, now here, now there, to force his way through. The First and Second Roumanian armies, however, maintained a stout resistance, while the Fourth, which had debouched from the Carpathians, continued to drive the Austrians westward. But the disaster at Turturcai, the invasion of the Dobruja, and finally Mackensen's menace to Bucharest had already absorbed the Romanian Central Reserve of 50,000 men. General Averescu, placed in command of the southern front, peremptorily demanded that the Romanian Fourth Army should be recalled from Transylvania, that the Second and Third Armies should be reduced to the minimum compatible with holding the passes, and that the whole strength of Romania should be thrown against the Bulgarians. This, at any rate, was a military plan. It was resisted with equal vehemence by General Presan, who commanded in the north. The controversy was acute, and the debate well balanced. In the end, as would be expected, a compromise was reached whereby General Presan continued to invade Transylvania with forces too weak to be effective, and General Averescu obtained enough troops from the armies holding the passes to endanger the defense, but not enough to overcome the Bulgarians. Romania had now been at war for 2 months, and by the beginning of November 5 additional German divisions and 2 cavalry divisions had joined Falkenhayn's army. Thus powerfully reinforced, he attacked the Vulcan Pass in earnest. By November 26 he had forced his way through and entered the Romanian plain, descending the valley of the Jiu and incidentally cutting off the Romanian forces holding the tip of the tongue near Orsova. This movement compromised in succession the defense of the other passes. By the end of November, Falkenhayn had joined hands with Mackensen from across the Danube, and on December 6, after a well-contested 3-days battle between Falkenhayn's and Mackensen's armies, together amounting to 15 divisions, and what was left of the Romanian forces, he entered Bucharest in triumph. The Romanians, defending themselves stubbornly, retreated eastward towards the considerable Russian army, which had now at last arrived. Notwithstanding torrential rains and winter conditions, Falkenhayn and Mackensen followed apace. The roads ceased to exist. The troops were short of food and every necessity. Ludendorff, according to Falkenhayn, sent floods of telegrams as superfluous as they were unpleasant, but neither winter clothing nor supplies. Footnote: In Der Feldzug der 9. Armee 1916–17, Part 2, pages 93 to 100. End of footnote. Still, the Germans persevered, and after a series of stern battles, mainly against Russian forces, reached the Sereth River on January 7. Here their advance ended. The tongue of Romania had been torn out by its roots. There remained of that unhappy kingdom only the northern province. In this narrow region around the town of Jassy, what remained of the armies which 4 months before had entered the war so full of hope, endured for many months privation and even famine, from which not only thousands of soldiers, but far larger numbers of refugees perished lamentably. Thus did Romania share in the end the hideous miseries of all the Balkan peoples. How unteachable, how blind by their passions are the races of man! The Great War, bringing tribulation to so many, offered to the Christian peoples of the Balkans their supreme opportunity. Others had to toil and dare and suffer. They had only to forgive and to unite. By a single spontaneous realization of their common interests, the Confederation of the Balkans would have become one of the great powers of Europe, with Constantinople under some international instrument as its combined capital. A concerted armed neutrality followed by decisive intervention at the chosen moment against their common enemies, Turkey and Austria, could easily have given each individual state the major part of its legitimate ambitions, and would have given to all safety, prosperity, and power. They chose instead to drink in company the corrosive cup of internecine vengeance, and the cup is not yet drained. Meanwhile, on the heights of Verdun, new figures destined powerfully to sway the course of events began to emerge under the blast of the cannonade. Petain's most successful commander was a certain General Nivelle, an artillery officer who, by courage and address, had won his way from a modest station to the head of an army corps. Nivelle's fighting arm was a certain General Mangin, of whom some brief description is required. Mangin belonged to the French colonial army and had made his name in Morocco and Tunis. He had led Marchand's advanced guard to Fashoda in 1898, engaged at the head of a brigade in the opening days of the war. He had won distinction at Dinant and Charleroi. In the widespread breaking of incompetent leaders which followed the opening defeats of the French army, Mangin succeeded to the command of a dispirited division from whose control a discredited figure had been removed. "After having at our head," wrote a young royalist who served as a clerk on the staff of his division, "a walking ruin, we actually possess one of the best generals of the French army." Footnote: Désoré la honte à Mangin le Boucher, by Henry Doutet, page 88. End of footnote. Mangin was not to belie this reputation. Bronzed and sombre, thick black hair bristling, an aquiline profile with gleaming eyes and teeth, alive and active, furious, luxurious, privileged, acquisitive. A dozen motor cars collected from all quarters, including the enemy, in his train as a simple colonel of brigade, reckless of all lives and of none more than his own, charging at the head of his troops, fighting rifle in hand when he could escape from his headquarters, thundering down the telephone implacable orders to his subordinates and, when necessary, defiance to his superiors. Mangin, beaten or triumphant, Mangin the hero or Mangin the butcher, as he was alternately regarded, became, on the anvil of Verdun, the fiercest warrior figure of France. During the spring, Pétain entrusted the direction of the most important operations to Nivelle, and Nivelle confined their execution in the main to Mangin. When in April, after 3 months of battle, Pétain was promoted from Verdun to the command of a group of armies, Nivelle, Mangin still in hand, succeeded to the direction of the struggle. One of the earliest decisions of the Hindenburg-Ludendorff regime had been to arrest the Verdun offensive, and from the end of August to the intense relief of the Crown Prince, the German armies before the fortress adopted a purely defensive attitude. The decision, wise in the disastrous circumstances, presented nevertheless a fine opportunity to the French. A long month of battle had left the German line wedge-shaped. The fort of Douaumont, in actual contact with the very tip, was at once the greatest and nearest trophy for France. Nothing would set the seal of defeat upon the German effort at Verdun more dramatically than the recapture of Douaumont, famous all over the world. It was on this that Nivelle and Mangin set their hearts. The preparations were long and thorough. 530 heavy pieces, including a new 16-inch Creusot battery, in addition to the ordinary artillery of the Verdun army, were concentrated upon the German salient. or a gun to every 15 yards of the front to be attacked. The 3 divisions which were to make the assault were brought to the highest point of strength and efficiency and trained for more than a month behind the line in the exact parts each was to play. The bombardment began in the middle of October and fell with fury on all the German defenses and organizations. The chief target was the German artillery. By the 20th, nearly a third of the German batteries had been put out of action. On the 22nd at 2 p.m. the French fire on the German front lines was suddenly lifted and the range lengthened. The stratagem was successful. Here, then, thought the Germans, was the moment of assault. 158 German batteries, hitherto concealed, opened fire, betraying alike their own position and their system of defensive barrages. Of these 158 batteries, only 90 remained in action when the true moment arrived. 3 fine days preceded the 24th of October, but on the day itself a dense fog overspread the ground. There was a moment of discussion at the French headquarters whether the attack should be postponed. But Mangin rightly judged that the fog hampered the defense at least as much as the attack. His view prevailed. The French trench mortars, secretly massed on an unprecedented scale, a new feature, opened a terrific fire on the German front line, crouching in the shell holes to which their trenches were reduced, and after 2 hours the French infantry, in the old passion of calculation and devotion, marched upon their ancient foe. In 2 hours more all was over. The German wedge was bitten off. The tricolor flew again upon Fort Douaumont, and 6,000 German prisoners were in Mangin's cages. The cornerstone of Verdun, as the Germans had precipitately called it, had been regained, and the name of Verdun was registered in history as one of the greatest misfortunes of the German arms. In this brilliant local victory there lay, as will soon be seen, the seeds of a memorable disappointment.